The first thing you want to do before working with resin is to cover your work area with newspaper to protect it. You'll also want to wear some sort of protective latex or plastic gloves. I'd also highly recommend you're getting some kind of filtered mask that protects against organic vapors, especially if you're going to work with this stuff on a regular basis. Resin gives off dangerous fumes. Work with it outdoors if possible or in a well-ventilated area. There are generally two types of resin used for clear gem casting. One is polyester resin, which often comes in large cans like this. To use this resin, you will need to mix it with a catalyst agent, which is sold separately. There should be a chart on the back of your resin that tells you how to mix it with the catalyst. The ratio of resin to catalyst will depend on the amount of your resin and on the depth of your gem mold. To weigh your resin, you will need a small scale. There are many types available ranging from precise digital scales to small plastic food scales, which you can find at just about any department store. These scales also come in handy for weighing silicone or other molding materials if you decide to get into mold making. The advantages of working with polyester resin. It's easy to find at most craft stores, and it makes clear gems with few or no embedded bubbles. The disadvantages of working with polyester resin. It has an unpleasant smell, it requires a scale and some effort to mix to the right proportions, and it can result in sticky back gems that are a challenge to demold. The other kind of resin used for gem casting is epoxy resin, but a special kind of epoxy resin called Easy Cast Clear Casting Epoxy. This is epoxy resin that has been specifically designed for casting small clear items. Other types of epoxy resin, such as that used for coating tabletops, can harden with bubbles embedded within it. But the Easy Cast hardens with very minimal bubbles, and it's what I prefer to use for all my gem casting. Epoxy resin is very easy to mix as it's comprised of two chemicals, mixed in a 1-to-1 ratio. The directions included with the package will tell you how long you should mix the chemicals and how to pour them. The advantages of working with clear epoxy resin. It has a minimal smell when compared to polyester resin. It's easy to mix in a 1-to-1 ratio, and if mixed correctly, results in gems with a non-sticky backing. The disadvantages of working with clear epoxy resin. Air bubbles. Even the clear cast epoxy resin can form air bubbles if you're not careful. The Easy Cast brand resin may also be hard to find if you're not willing to shop around online. Whatever resin you decide to choose, you'll find the mixing procedure is largely the same. Mixing should be done in a small paper or plastic cup. You should not use a styrofoam cup, as resin will melt styrofoam on contact. Certain types of plastic might melt as well, so always make sure to test your mixing cup by pouring a small amount of mixed resin into it to see how it reacts before pouring a large amount in. You'll need a stirring utensil of some kind, one with a wide flat surface that can scrape the resin and dye off of the walls of your cup. If a utensil isn't included with your resin kit, a plastic knife or a popsicle stick should work well. Coloring your resin. You can color your resin with the help of transparent dyes that have been specifically made for use with resin. You can usually find these at any place online or otherwise where casting resin is sold. Sometimes they'll come in kits containing the 3 primary colors. In theory, you can mix these dyes together to come up with any color of the rainbow, but some dye brands wind up creating muddy colors when mixed. If you want to make green-colored gemstones, I would just recommend you buy a straight green dye. Only mix together colors that are closely related, and you should be able to avoid muddiness. Food coloring or any other dyeing agent that isn't specifically made to be used with resin should not be used. You'll only wind up ruining your batch of resin. Mixing your resin. Mixing epoxy resin is, as I've said, easy. You simply pour a small amount from one of the bottles into your mixing cup and then try to pour in that exact amount from the other bottle. Check the levels of the bottles as you pour. If you want to be exact, you can measure out each chemical into 2 separate cups and then mix the 2 cups together. Polyester resin should be weighed before mixing. You should pour out the amount that you want into your cup and place it onto your scale. Once you've determined the weight of the resin, check your mixing chart and pour in the number of drops of catalyst that are required for the desired thickness of your gemstones. You don't have to be exact to get good results, but the mixture ratio will directly affect the amount of time it will take for polyester resin gemstones to harden. When stirring your resin, make sure you do so with a gentle circular motion. scraping the resin off of the sides of your mixing cup. The more gentle you are, the fewer bubbles you'll create. Consult the directions in your resin package to see how long you should stir the material. Mixing in your dye. Again, you should be using a transparent resin dye for gem casting, not an opaque one, unless you want to create a gem that you can't see through. The dye should be added 1 drop at a time. You'll have to experiment a bit to see how much dye you'll need for a certain project. Seeing how it looks in the bottom of the mixing cup may not be enough to give you an accurate idea. You might have to pour a few test gems first. The red dye that you'll find in a primary color dye package is actually magenta, or a deep pink. If you want to make gems that are a deep cherry red, you'll have to add a couple of drops of yellow to your magenta dye. Mix the dye into the cup for a bit, then get yourself a second cup and pour the resin from the first cup into that one, scraping the sides of the first cup carefully. This is called the double pour method of mixing, and it will ensure that your resin and dye are thoroughly mixed. There should be no dark streaks or any areas of unmixed dye within your cup. Pouring your resin. Pouring should be done slowly and carefully to minimize bubbles. You can sometimes get rid of bubbles in epoxy resin by gently blowing on the surface of the resin after you've poured it. The carbon dioxide in your breath will pop the bubbles. However, you should take care not to breathe in while your face is close to the mold. Handmade molds of any kind should always be placed into disposable containers to harden, just in case the mold fails or leaks. The same goes for any mold you fill if you think there's a chance the resin could spill out over the sides. You may notice that the same batch of resin can produce gems that are vastly different in shade, depending on the depth and size of the gem mold. A gem mold with shallow depressions will make gems of a lighter color, and a gem mold with deeper depressions will create thicker, more darkly colored gems. This is extremely important to take note of if you're trying to cast gems that are the exact same color, but are of different thicknesses and sizes. You may have to add additional dye to your batch of resin at certain points in the pouring process to create gems that are all one uniform color. The directions on your resin package will tell you how long you'll have to wait for your gems to harden. You'll probably have to wait at least 12 to 24 hours. If you're letting your resin sit outside, then cold, damp weather may slow the hardening process, and some types of weather, for instance really humid weather, may cause your gems to not harden at all. I'd recommend sheltering your molds when putting them outside. Place them into a cardboard box with high walls to prevent the wind from blowing dirt and grass into them.